The avoidant's most devastating mistake unfolds in slow motion as they convince themselves that their new supply represents an upgrade from you, that this new person's different qualities prove superior to yours, and that their fresh relationship validates their decision to abandon what you offered in favor of someone who initially appears to better match their emotional limitations and defensive requirements. They enter this new connection with the arrogant certainty that they've traded up, that their new partner's qualities represent improvements over yours, and that their relationship choice demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of compatibility rather than revealing their profound inability to recognize genuine value. This mistake operates through their sophisticated self-deception machinery that transforms differences into superiority, novelty into improvement, and the absence of established patterns into evidence of better compatibility. The avoidant needs to believe they've found something better to justify their destruction of what you offered, to protect their ego from recognizing their self-sabotage, and to maintain comfortable narratives about their relationship choices, rather than confronting their consistent pattern of destroying valuable connections. The new supply initially appears perfect, precisely because they lack the history, depth, and emotional investment that characterized your relationship. Their emotional distance feels like respect for boundaries rather than limitations. Their lack of expectations feels like independence rather than indifference, and their inability to trigger the avoidance defensive patterns feels like compatibility rather than insufficient emotional capacity to create genuine intimacy that would expose the avoidance profound dysfunction. The avoidance belief in their upgrade crumbles gradually as the new relationship develops beyond initial idealization, as their defensive patterns reassert themselves despite the new person's different qualities, and as they begin recognizing that changing partners hasn't eliminated their attachment wounds or their systematic inability to sustain authentic, intimate connection with emotionally healthy partners who eventually require reciprocal care and sustained emotional presence. Most tragically, by the time the avoidant recognizes their mistake, when the new supply's limitations become undeniable, when comparisons to you consistently favor what they destroyed, when they realize they've traded genuine depth for superficial compatibility, you've typically moved beyond caring about their recognition, developed boundaries that prevent their return, and found peace in their absence that makes their belated awareness irrelevant to your well-being and emotional stability. The mistake reveals the avoidant's fundamental inability to recognize value while they possess it, their systematic pattern of idealizing what they don't have while devaluing what they do, and their consistent destruction of authentic connections in pursuit of relationships that feel safer because they lack the depth that triggers their attachment wounds and defensive programming. The illusion of upgrade. Why they think they found better. The avoidance belief that their new supply represents an upgrade operates through sophisticated psychological mechanisms that transform differences into improvements, creating elaborate justifications for why this new person's qualities prove superior to yours, despite objective evidence suggesting otherwise. This illusion serves their desperate need to rationalize their relationship choices, protect their ego from recognizing their self-sabotage, and maintain comfortable narratives about their emotional sophistication, rather than confronting their consistent pattern of destroying valuable connections. The upgrade illusion typically begins with their focus on superficial differences that feel significant during the idealization phase. Perhaps the new supply is more physically attractive, more professionally successful, more socially connected, or simply different enough from you that novelty feels like improvement rather than recognizing these differences as irrelevant to relationship depth and emotional compatibility that actually determines long-term satisfaction. Understanding this illusion means recognizing that avoidants need to believe they've made wise relationship choices to protect themselves from acknowledging their self-destructive patterns, their systematic rejection of genuine love, and their profound inability to recognize value while they possess access to authentic connection. The upgrade narrative protects them from devastating self-awareness about their emotional limitations and defensive dysfunction. The new supply initially appears superior precisely because they haven't yet established the emotional intimacy that triggers the avoidance defensive patterns, haven't yet demanded the reciprocal care that exposes the avoidance limitations, and haven't yet created the relationship depth that makes the avoidance emotional unavailability obvious and problematic. The absence of these triggering factors feels like compatibility rather than insufficient relationship development. Their belief in the upgrade often centers on the new supply's apparent lack of emotional needs, their comfortable independence, and their tolerance for emotional distance, qualities the avoidant interprets as emotional maturity, rather than recognizing these characteristics as either defensive wounds, matching their own, or temporary presentation that will shift once genuine intimacy develops and authentic emotional needs emerge. The avoidant convinces themselves that the new supply doesn't require the emotional availability you needed, doesn't demand the relationship investment you expected, and doesn't create the intimacy pressure you generated, never recognizing that your needs were normal and healthy, while the new supply's lack of needs often reflects either emotional unavailability, matching their own, or strategic presentation during early relationship phases. This upgrade illusion also serves their need to rewrite relationship history with you, transforming your genuine emotional capacity into excessive neediness, your authentic vulnerability into emotional instability, and your normal relationship expectations into unreasonable demands that justify their departure and validate their choice of someone who appears to require less emotional investment and reciprocal care. The avoidant often compares the new supply's best qualities against your worst moments, creating false equivalencies that favor their new partner by selectively remembering your relationship struggles while ignoring your strengths and conveniently forgetting that most conflicts emerged from their defensive patterns rather than your emotional excess or unreasonable expectations. Understanding the upgrade illusion reveals that it serves their psychological comfort rather than reflecting objective reality, that it protects them from accountability for their patterns rather than demonstrating their improved partner selection, and that it represents their continued self-deception rather than evidence of their personal growth or enhanced relationship capacity. The illusion becomes most elaborate when they publicly celebrate their new relationship, posting about their happiness and compatibility in ways they never did with you. Not because this relationship is actually superior, but because they need external validation for their choices and social proof that they made the right decision in abandoning what you offered for something that appears better to observers who don't understand the superficial nature of their connection. Most significantly, the upgrade illusion prevents them from recognizing that they're repeating identical patterns with different person, that their new relationship's apparent success stems from insufficient development rather than genuine compatibility, and that their defensive patterns will eventually destroy this connection just as they destroyed yours. Once the new supply begins requiring the emotional reciprocity and authentic presence that healthy relationships demand from both partners, the illusion also protects them from acknowledging that the new supply's different qualities don't actually address their attachment wounds, that changing partners doesn't heal their defensive programming, and that their relationship problems will reemerge regardless of who they're with, because their patterns, rather than their partner selection, determine their relationship outcomes and consistent inability to sustain authentic, intimate connections. The harsh reality, new supplies limitations emerge, the avoidance upgrade illusion begins crumbling when their new supplies limitations emerge with devastating clarity, revealing that the qualities they initially celebrated as improvements over you actually represent profound deficits that prevent the depth, authenticity, and genuine connection that characterized your relationship despite their defensive sabotage. The new supply's emotional distance transforms from attractive independence into frustrating unavailability. Their lack of demands shifts from refreshing autonomy into unsatisfying indifference, and their different qualities reveal themselves as limitations rather than the upgrades the avoidant desperately needed to believe they represented. This harsh reality typically emerges gradually as the relationship develops beyond initial idealization, as the avoidant discovers that the new supply's apparent lack of emotional needs actually reflects their inability to provide emotional depth rather than sophisticated boundaries, and as they recognize that this person's tolerance for distance stems from their own defensive wounds, rather than mature respect for the avoidance autonomy and independence requirements. Understanding these emerging limitations means recognizing that the avoidant begins experiencing the very problems they claim to be escaping from your relationship, feeling emotionally unsatisfied, craving deeper connection, and recognizing that their partner cannot provide the authentic intimacy and genuine care that they systematically rejected when you offered it freely, despite their defensive behavior and emotional unavailability. The new supply's limitations often include their inability to match your emotional intelligence, their lack of capacity for the empathy and understanding you demonstrated, and their absence of the patience and genuine investment that characterized your approach to the avoidance limitations. The avoidant discovers that different doesn't mean better, and that the new supply's qualities that initially felt like improvements actually prevent the relationship depth they unconsciously crave. These limitations become most apparent during stress, conflict, or moments requiring genuine emotional support, when the new supply demonstrates their inability to provide the care, understanding, and sustained presence you offered even during the avoidant's worst defensive episodes. The avoidant recognizes that the new supply lacks your emotional capacity, your willingness to work through difficulties, and your commitment to maintaining connection despite challenges. The harsh reality also includes the recognition that the new supply doesn't know them the way you did, hasn't invested the time and energy to understand their patterns and triggers, and lacks the intimate knowledge of their authentic self that you developed through sustained emotional engagement, despite their systematic attempts to prevent such deep knowing and genuine understanding. Most devastatingly, the avoidant discovers that the new supply's tolerance for their defensive patterns stems not from superior compatibility, but from insufficient emotional investment to care when the avoidant withdraws, insufficient attachment to be hurt by their distance, and insufficient depth to recognize the avoidant's behavior as problematic rather than acceptable relationship dynamic. The limitations reveal themselves through the new supply's inability to challenge the avoidant's growth, their lack of capacity to inspire the avoidant's better self, and their absence of the qualities that made you capable of seeing the avoidant's potential beneath their defensive behavior while maintaining appropriate boundaries that prevented complete enabling of their dysfunction. Understanding these emerging limitations forces the avoidant to confront that they've traded your genuine depth for superficial compatibility, your authentic care for someone's indifference disguised as independence, and your real emotional investment for someone's minimal engagement that feels safe because it demands nothing challenging from their limited emotional capacity and defensive programming. The harsh reality includes recognizing that the new supply cannot provide the intellectual stimulation, emotional resonance, and authentic partnership that characterized your relationship during its best moments before the avoidance defensive sabotage destroyed what you built together through patient investment and genuine care despite receiving minimal reciprocity. Most significantly, the limitations force recognition that the new supply represents downgrade rather than upgrade, that their different qualities actually prevent rather than enhance relationship satisfaction, and that the avoidance partner selection was driven by their defensive needs rather than authentic compatibility or genuine relationship wisdom about what creates lasting satisfaction and meaningful connection. The reality also reveals that the new supply's apparent perfection was actually absence of developed relationship rather than presence of superior qualities, that their lack of triggering the avoidance defensive patterns reflected their emotional shallowness rather than ideal compatibility, and that their tolerance for the avoidance limitations stemmed from their own dysfunction rather than mature understanding and appropriate boundaries. When they compare and you win, every time, the avoidance devastating recognition arrives when every honest comparison between you and their new supply consistently favors what they destroyed, when your qualities prove superior across every dimension that actually matters for relationship depth and authentic satisfaction, and when they're forced to acknowledge that their supposed upgrade represents significant downgrade from the genuine love and authentic partnership you offered, despite their systematic emotional neglect and defensive sabotage. This comparison process typically begins unconsciously as the avoidant notices small ways the new supply falls short of your capabilities, your emotional depth, and your genuine investment in their well-being. These observations accumulate until the pattern becomes undeniable. You were better at understanding them, better at managing conflict, better at providing emotional support, better at maintaining connection, and fundamentally better at loving them despite their profound limitations. Understanding these comparisons means recognizing that the avoidant begins measuring everything about their new relationship against what you provided. The new supplies communication skills against your emotional intelligence, their capacity for empathy against your genuine understanding, their investment in the relationship against your sustained care, despite receiving minimal reciprocity and consistent defensive withdrawal. The comparisons reveal themselves during everyday moments when the new supply responds to situations in ways that highlight your superior emotional capacity. They lack your patience during the avoidance withdrawal. They cannot match your ability to see beneath defensive behavior, and they fail to provide the genuine care and authentic presence that characterized your approach to the relationship despite its challenges. These comparisons become most painful during difficult moments when the avoidant needs support and recognizes that the new supply cannot provide what you offered freely. Your ability to remain calm during their defensive episodes, your capacity to maintain connection despite their distance, and your willingness to invest emotional energy in someone who consistently demonstrated their inability to reciprocate appropriately. The avoidant discovers that conversations with the new supply lack the depth, authenticity, and genuine engagement that characterized your interactions, that physical intimacy feels hollow compared to the emotional connection you created, and that daily life together provides less satisfaction than what they systematically destroyed through their defensive patterns and emotional unavailability. Most devastatingly, the comparisons extend beyond specific qualities to encompass the entire relationship experience. They recognize that being with the new supply feels less fulfilling than being with you felt during your relationship's best moments, that they laugh less genuinely, share less authentically, and experience less genuine joy than what they took for granted while they had access to your love and sustained emotional investment. The avoidant realizes that the new supply cannot match your intellectual stimulation, your emotional resonance, your genuine care for their well-being, your investment in their growth, or your capacity to see their authentic self beneath their defensive presentation. Every dimension of comparison favors what they destroyed while pursuing someone they convinced themselves represented improvement. Understanding these comparisons forces recognition that they made catastrophic mistake in leaving you, that their assessment of the new supply as superior was elaborate self-deception serving their defensive needs, and that they destroyed something genuinely valuable while pursuing relationship that provides superficial comfort but lacks the depth and authenticity that creates lasting satisfaction. The comparisons also reveal that your supposed flaws, your emotional needs, your desire for reciprocity, your expectations for genuine intimacy were actually strengths that demonstrated your capacity for authentic love and healthy relationship engagement, while the new supply's lack of such needs reflects their emotional limitations rather than superior compatibility. Most painfully, the avoidant recognizes that every quality they criticized in you, your emotional expression, your vulnerability, your investment in the relationship, actually represented your superior capacity for authentic connection, while their new supply's lack of these qualities reflects emotional poverty rather than the sophisticated independence they initially celebrated as improvement. The comparisons become inescapable when the avoidant realizes that mundane daily experiences feel less satisfying with the new supply, that achieving personal goals feels less meaningful without your genuine celebration, and that facing life's challenges feels more difficult without your authentic support and sustained emotional presence that they systematically rejected and undervalued. Understanding why you win every comparison reveals that genuine love, authentic care, and sustained emotional investment cannot be replicated or replaced by different qualities in new partners, that the depth you offered required specific emotional capacity that most people don't possess, and that the avoidance destruction of your relationship represents loss that cannot be recovered through pursuit of supposedly superior supply who lacks your fundamental qualities. The painful recognition of what they destroyed. The avoidance mistake transforms into excruciating awareness when they finally recognize the full scope of what they destroyed. Not just a relationship, but a rare combination of genuine love, exceptional patience, authentic understanding, and sustained emotional investment that they will likely never encounter again in someone willing to provide such resources to their emotionally limited and defensively unavailable personality. This recognition arrives with devastating clarity as they compare the hollow superficiality of their new supply against the profound depth and authentic care you offered, despite receiving minimal reciprocity and consistent emotional neglect. This painful recognition typically emerges through accumulated evidence that overwhelms their defensive rationalizations, moments when they need the specific support only you could provide, situations where they recognize how you would have responded compared to their new supply's inadequate reactions, and countless daily experiences that highlight the exceptional nature of what they took for granted while they possessed access to your love and genuine care. Understanding this recognition means acknowledging that the avoidant finally sees you as you actually were, rather than through their defensive lens that minimized your worth to protect them from acknowledging their profound need for what you offered. They recognize your patience as strength rather than weakness, your emotional investment as generosity rather than neediness, and your sustained care as exceptional gift rather than standard relationship expectation. The recognition includes their devastating awareness that you offered them exactly what their attachment wounds required for healing: consistent love that didn't abandon them during their worst defensive episodes, patient understanding that saw their potential beneath their behavior, and sustained emotional investment despite receiving minimal reciprocity and systematic relationship sabotage through their defensive patterns. This awareness extends to recognizing specific qualities that made you irreplaceable: your capacity to remain calm during their emotional storms, your ability to see through their defensive behavior to their authentic needs, your willingness to maintain hope for their growth despite consistent evidence of their limitations, and your exceptional emotional intelligence that allowed you to navigate their complex defensive programming. The avoidant realizes they destroyed someone who genuinely loved them despite knowing their flaws, who invested energy in understanding their patterns rather than simply judging their behavior, and who maintained faith in their capacity for growth, even when they consistently demonstrated their unwillingness to change their defensive strategies and emotional management patterns. Most painfully, the recognition includes acknowledging that they had everything they needed for genuine satisfaction and potential healing: authentic love, patient support, emotional safety, and sustained investment. But their attachment wounds prevented them from receiving what you offered until after they'd successfully driven you away through their systematic emotional unavailability and defensive sabotage. The avoidant confronts that they destroyed not just your relationship, but your willingness to continue investing in them, your capacity to believe in their potential, and your openness to their eventual growth that you maintained despite years of evidence suggesting such growth would never materialize while they remained committed to their defensive patterns over authentic connection. Understanding this recognition reveals that they finally comprehend they weren't leaving someone inadequate for someone better, but rather destroying something genuinely valuable while pursuing hollow substitute that initially felt safer because it lacked the depth that triggered their attachment wounds and required reciprocal emotional investment they couldn't sustain. The painful awareness includes recognizing that you represented their best opportunity for healing, growth, and genuine satisfaction, but their defensive programming interpreted your exceptional qualities as threats rather than recognizing them as the gifts they actually represented for someone whose wounds required exactly what you offered freely. The recognition also encompasses their understanding that they cannot undo what they've destroyed, that apologies cannot restore what years of emotional neglect eliminated, and that their belated appreciation arrives too late to matter because you've developed the boundaries and self-protection that prevent their return to someone whose emotional investment they systematically exploited and undervalued. Most devastatingly, the avoidant realizes that their destruction was entirely preventable, that they possessed all necessary information to make different choices, and that their attachment wounds, rather than your inadequacy, drove them to destroy the very connection that could have provided the healing and satisfaction they unconsciously craved but were too terrified to receive. New supplies' refusal to tolerate their patterns. The avoidance mistake becomes undeniable when their new supply, who they believed would be more compatible with their emotional limitations, begins refusing to tolerate the defensive patterns that you endured for months or years, establishing boundaries and consequences that force the avoidant to confront that their supposed upgrade actually possesses less patience, understanding, and willingness to accommodate their dysfunction than you demonstrated throughout your relationship. This refusal typically emerges as the relationship develops beyond initial idealization, when the new supply recognizes the avoidance defensive patterns and responds with immediate consequences rather than the patient understanding you provided. The new supply exits during conflicts you would have worked through, establishes firm boundaries around behavior you tolerated, and demands reciprocity from the beginning, rather than accepting minimal emotional investment. Understanding this dynamic means recognizing that the avoidant expected their new supplies' different qualities to mean greater compatibility with their limitations, not realizing that emotionally healthy partners establish appropriate boundaries that prevent the exploitation and emotional neglect you unconsciously enabled through your exceptional patience and sustained investment despite receiving minimal reciprocal care. The new supplier's refusal manifests through their unwillingness to wait indefinitely for emotional availability that never materializes, their immediate exit when the avoidance defensive patterns emerge, and their clear communication that they won't invest in someone demonstrating such obvious inability to provide reciprocal emotional care and authentic presence within the relationship. This refusal forces the avoidant to recognize that your tolerance was exceptional rather than standard, that your patience represented strength rather than weakness, and that your willingness to work through their defensive episodes demonstrated your superior emotional capacity rather than your supposed neediness or emotional instability that they used to justify their departure. The avoidant discovers that the new supply won't accommodate their need for excessive space, won't tolerate their emotional withdrawal during intimacy, won't accept their systematic unavailability during important moments, and won't provide the unlimited understanding and patient support that characterized your approach to their limitations throughout your relationship. Most painfully, the new supply's refusal highlights how much you tolerated that emotionally healthy people recognize as unacceptable relationship behavior. Your accommodation of their patterns prevented them from experiencing natural consequences that might have motivated change earlier, while protecting them from recognizing how their defensive strategies affect partners with appropriate self-respect. The avoidant realizes that maintaining relationships with their new supply requires emotional availability they cannot consistently provide, that their defensive patterns generate immediate consequences rather than patient accommodation, and that people with healthy boundaries exit relationships when patterns emerge that you endured while maintaining hope for their eventual growth and capacity for reciprocal care. Understanding this refusal reveals that the new supply's supposed superiority actually reflects their unwillingness to provide what you offered, that their different approach stems from appropriate self-protection rather than ideal compatibility, and that their boundaries highlight your exceptional patience that the avoidant systematically exploited and undervalued throughout your relationship. The new supply's refusal also demonstrates that the avoidant cannot find another you, because people with your emotional capacity typically possess corresponding self-respect that prevents them from tolerating treatment you accepted, that their defensive patterns eliminate their access to partners with your depth and investment, and that their supposed upgrade actually represents someone less willing to accommodate their dysfunction. Most significantly, the refusal forces recognition that they cannot maintain relationships with emotionally healthy partners while continuing their defensive patterns, that their new supply's boundaries reveal the abnormality of your tolerance, and that they face choice between changing their patterns or accepting relationships with people whose emotional limitations match their own, rather than partners with your superior capacity for authentic love. The avoidant discovers that their new supply won't sacrifice their emotional well-being to accommodate defensive behavior, won't maintain hope for growth that never materializes, and won't provide the sustained investment despite minimal reciprocity that characterized your exceptional approach to loving someone whose attachment wounds made them incapable of appreciating what you offered until after they destroyed your willingness to continue providing such generous care. The desperate attempt to recreate what they lost. The avoidance recognition of their catastrophic mistake often triggers desperate attempts to recreate with their new supply the depth, authenticity, and emotional connection that characterized their relationship with you, not recognizing that such depth cannot be manufactured through effort or replicated with someone who lacks your specific emotional capacity, patience, and willingness to invest in their growth, despite their defensive patterns. These attempts reveal the profound gap between what they destroyed and what they currently possess, highlighting that their supposed upgrade cannot provide the genuine satisfaction and authentic partnership you offered. This desperate recreation typically manifests through the avoidance attempts to force intimacy, manufacture emotional depth, and create relationship significance that develops naturally with compatible partners, but cannot be artificially produced with someone whose emotional limitations or different personality prevents the organic development of authentic connection. They try to teach their new supply to respond like you did, to understand them as you understood them, and to provide the care you offered naturally. Understanding these attempts means recognizing that the avoidant finally appreciates what you provided, but discovers that your specific qualities, your emotional intelligence, your genuine empathy, your patient understanding, cannot be found in or developed within someone who simply doesn't possess your emotional capacity or willingness to invest in their defensive and emotionally unavailable personality. The recreation attempts include trying to have the same types of conversations you shared, seeking the same level of emotional support you provided, and expecting the same patience and understanding you demonstrated, only to discover that the new supply cannot match your responses, doesn't possess your insight, and lacks your capacity for the sustained emotional investment that made your connection feel deep and meaningful, despite the avoidant's systematic sabotage. These desperate efforts reveal themselves through the avoidance frustration when the new supply doesn't intuitively understand their needs the way you learned to, doesn't respond to their defensive patterns with your specific combination of boundaries and compassion, and cannot provide the emotional safety and authentic care that you created through years of patient investment in understanding their attachment wounds. The avoidant attempts to recreate specific experiences that felt meaningful with you, particular activities, conversation topics, relationship rituals, only to discover that these experiences feel hollow with someone who lacks your emotional presence, genuine engagement, and authentic investment in creating shared meaning, rather than simply participating in activities without the depth that made such moments significant. Most painfully, the recreation attempts force recognition that relationship depth cannot be manufactured or rushed, that authentic connection requires specific emotional capacities that not everyone possesses, and that your particular combination of qualities created unique relationship dynamic that cannot be replicated with different person, regardless of how desperately the avoidant tries to recreate what they destroyed. The avoidant discovers that asking their new supply to be more like you highlights the new supply's limitations, while simultaneously revealing that they're trying to force someone into a role they cannot fulfill, rather than accepting that they destroyed something irreplaceable when they abandoned your genuine love for someone they convinced themselves represented improvement. Understanding these desperate attempts reveals that the avoidant finally recognizes your value, but discovers this recognition too late to benefit from what you offered, that they cannot find or create another you, because your qualities were unique rather than common, and that their attempts to recreate what they lost only highlight the profound mistake they made in leaving someone whose specific capacities match their needs. The recreation attempts also demonstrate their continued emotional immaturity and their inability to accept reality. Instead of acknowledging that they destroyed something irreplaceable, they try to force their current situation to match their idealized memory of what they lost, refusing to accept that their choices have consequences that cannot be undone through desperate efforts to manufacture depth that develops naturally or not at all. Most devastatingly, these attempts reveal to the new supply that they're being compared unfavorably to you, that the avoidant wishes they possessed your qualities, and that they represent inadequate substitute for what the avoidant destroyed, rather than being valued for their own authentic qualities and genuine self that deserves someone who appreciates them, rather than trying to transform them into replacement for irreplaceable X. The desperate recreation ultimately fails because authentic connection cannot be forced, emotional depth cannot be manufactured, and your specific qualities cannot be found in or developed within someone who lacks your emotional capacity, making the avoidance attempts serve only to highlight their devastating mistake while creating dissatisfaction in their current relationship that stems from their impossible expectations. Why they can never admit their mistake, the avoidance recognition of their catastrophic error in believing their new supply represented an upgrade rarely translates into honest admission of their mistake. because such admission would require destroying their carefully constructed ego protection, acknowledging their profound poor judgment, and confronting that their supposed emotional sophistication led them to abandon genuine love for hollow substitute that initially felt safer but provides no authentic satisfaction or meaningful connection. This inability to admit their mistake operates through sophisticated defensive mechanisms that protect their self-image from the devastating blow of recognizing they destroyed something genuinely valuable through their own choices, that their partner assessment was fundamentally flawed, and that their emotional limitations rather than superior discernment drove their relationship decisions and systematic destruction of authentic connection. Understanding why they cannot admit their mistake means recognizing that such admission would require the avoidant to acknowledge they were wrong about you, wrong about their new supply, wrong about their own emotional needs, and wrong about their sophisticated understanding of relationships and compatibility, a level of ego damage their defensive programming cannot tolerate without complete psychological collapse. The inability to admit manifests through continued public celebration of their new relationship despite private recognition of its limitations, ongoing justification of their choice despite accumulating evidence of their error, and systematic rationalization that transforms their obvious downgrade into complex compatibility that others cannot understand, rather than admitting they made devastating mistake in abandoning you. This defensive protection includes their need to maintain the narrative that they made wise relationship choice, that their departure from you was justified by your supposed inadequacy, and that their new supply's different qualities represent improvements rather than acknowledging that they traded your genuine depth for someone's superficial compatibility with their emotional limitations. The avoidant cannot admit their mistake because doing so would require contacting you to acknowledge their error, facing the reality that you've moved beyond caring about their recognition, and confronting that their belated awareness arrives too late to matter because you've developed boundaries preventing their return to someone whose love they systematically exploited and destroyed. Most significantly, admission would require them to take full responsibility for destroying something valuable through their defensive choices, rather than blaming relationship failure on incompatibility, your supposed neediness, or circumstances beyond their control. A level of accountability their attachment wounds and defensive programming make psychologically impossible to accept. The inability to admit also protects them from experiencing appropriate guilt and remorse for their treatment of you, for their systematic devaluation of your worth, and for their arrogant certainty that they could easily find someone better than the exceptional partner they took for granted, while they possessed access to your genuine love and sustained emotional investment. Understanding this inability reveals that the avoidant will likely maintain their public narrative about their upgrade while privately suffering the recognition of their mistake, that they'll continue justifying their choice to protect their ego while knowing they destroyed something irreplaceable, and that they'll remain trapped in their self-deception rather than admitting error that would require devastating ego damage. The avoidant also cannot admit their mistake, because doing so would require acknowledging that their emotional limitations rather than superior judgment drove their relationship choices, that their defensive patterns rather than your inadequacy destroyed your connection, and that their attachment wounds rather than relationship incompatibility explain their consistent inability to sustain authentic, intimate partnerships. Most tragically, their inability to admit their mistake ensures they continue repeating identical patterns with future partners, that they learn nothing from destroying your relationship, and that they remain trapped in cycles of idealizing new supply while devaluing current partners without recognizing their consistent role in creating relationship dissatisfaction through their defensive strategies. The defensive protection also includes their need to avoid facing how much you've moved forward without them, how little their recognition matters to your current well-being, and how completely you've recovered from their abandonment while they remain stuck, comparing every new relationship to what they destroyed and finding each subsequent connection inadequate compared to the genuine love they systematically rejected. Understanding why they cannot admit their mistake helps you recognize that their continued justification of their choice reflects their limitations rather than truth about your worth, that their inability to acknowledge error demonstrates their continued emotional immaturity, and that their defensive protection of their ego prevents the growth and self-awareness that genuine admission would require from someone capable of authentic accountability and meaningful personal development.